Hello and welcome to Comedy in a Nutshell, a podcast with me, Mark Decano, in which I try to befuddle the Oxford English Dictionary with alternative definitions of the word comedy by asking those in the know what comedy means to them, and maybe come up with a more up-to-date definition of the word comedy. But probably not. I love talking to the people in comedy about comedy. If you like to hear what I have to say as much as I do, then please like, subscribe, rate, review and share the podcast. Thank you. My guest this episode is a former philosophy teacher turned philosophy joker. He's been variously described in reviews as ingenious, witty, positive, impressive, engaging and jaw-achingly funny. It's stand-up comedian Alex Farrow. If you're happy and good to go, we'll crack on.
Well, let's do it. What I can do is that thing that all stand-ups are very good at doing at the moment, where they go, "Oh, I'll tell you a secret," or something I don't normally say, and then they'll say that every night to audiences all up and down the country. All that, I love all that sort of parasocial stuff. Yeah. So, just for you and the audience, Mark, this is all a little secret for us. Nice.
So, tell me, what was your route into comedy? How did you get started?
I'd recently become a school teacher, and I think I was looking for a way to extend my youth. I'd been a very big fan of, like a pint and a party, and I think that's very fun up until the age of about 21. And then you you very quickly, if you're like a quote-unquote young teacher, I started when I was about 22, 23. If you're a young teacher, you suddenly go from this relatively kind of unstructured, somewhat kind of hedonistic lifestyle to suddenly having all these children that are your responsibility. Because you've moved from sort of child to parent very quickly. And I don't think I was quite ready for that. And so my best friend, Will, and I think we're looking for something in between the student life of going out to Union Bar or whatever, and then, feeling like divorced dads before our time. And so we thought it would be a hilarious idea to pretend to be stand-up comedians. We did a open mic night in London. I wasn't even living in London at the time. And we're like, that'll be fun. Yeah. But purely for almost, I feel guilty to say, through real no love of comedy on our part, just through pure like sort of thrill. We were real sort of thrill seekers. Like he went through a period of sort of taking sort of statues from, places when he was drunk and stuff like that. And so this was a sort of a more wholesome way of getting a thrill on a night out. And I didn't even write any material. I was like, that would make it too safe. So I sort of improvised what I still believe to be one of the worst comedy sets that must have ever been performed at any sort of stage. Yeah. And that was all very sort of scary and stuff like that. Right. And then didn't really think about it for about a year. Yeah. And then sort of another year passes, and Will and I are like, "Oh, do you remember that time that we, went up on stage with no material? That was really scary." And then we're like, "Should we do it again?" And we're like, nah, we've done that now. What we thought would be funny would be if we wrote really, really unfunny comedy sets for each other. Right. And then we'd have to perform them for this poor, unsuspecting sort of audience. Yeah. We're talking like really like sort of whack and hack, I think would be the right word for what we were supposed to be writing for each other. Yeah. Anyway, I did my set and had a right old bomb. Only one person laughing very loudly in the crowd was my friend Will. I mean, like truly, we didn't get to see the sets before we went on stage, so you had to sort of read out as was. Yeah. horrendous. I gave Will a briefcase full of all these props, this kind of prop comedy type stuff. Anyway, like he had the first prop was a brick, for example, with a mobile phone taped to it, and had a big aerial on it that he pulled the aerial out. And basically I sort of gave him instructions over his brick phone about what to do. The twist of the story is, anyway, he absolutely crushes. He's, to this day, one of the hardest wins at a gig I think I've ever seen. Anyway, so he comes off stage and he's being swamped by people. Oh my God, that was so funny. He's like, how long have you been going for? He's like, it's just my second gig. And I'm like, oh, by the way, I wrote that. And people are like, yeah, sure, mate. Yeah, nice, I bet. And so that made me want to do it, I think. Yeah. Maybe a long story, but it was a real an accident of being a sort of younger thrill seeker. But
it's interesting, like your first two outings are kind of experimental. I mean, that's got to be like, is that naivety or arrogance, or where does that come from? Just sort of going, let's just throw away any possible conceit, any rules or anything?
For any new comedian, and sometimes I do little mentor type things with newer comics or writing sessions with Angel Comedy. I always say you are at your most creative when you're just starting. Like, write down like everything, because you're not being trapped by the expectations of the format. You're not being trapped by the expectations of needing to be like paid or needing to be booked again. There's a real, like, you get it with students sometimes. Right. You get a creativity. It's almost certainly a word of it, but you get a creativity that comes from not knowing. It's like a sort of an inverse bell curve or something like that. Like, your creativity and skill is not always a continuous line. You're often much more creative before you really know anything about the format that you're dealing with. But then you don't have any of the skills to polish and refrain it, right? So you have to sort of write down everything. I used to do all sorts of mad stuff. I used to take a toaster on stage. I had to feed audience sort of jam and stuff like that. Really different to like Mr. Philosophy, which is the Alex Farrow brand these days. Yeah. Although maybe I'll bring the toast a bit back. I mean, it was dusty. You get all breadcrumbs of every gig that you went to, so I have to bring a dustpan and brush everywhere. Yeah. But I imagine it's lots of comics who, I don't know, I wonder who the audience for this is. But if it is comics listening and you are,
I think mostly
a newer, and you're a newer comic, unsolicited advice from Alex Farrow is, you are never more creative than in your first few months or times doing it. Yeah. Like harvest that. Really do it.
Yeah. So when did your comedy style switch from this creativity to being being
a hack?
To being the philosophy guy,
rather than I suppose it's sort of rather than Mr. Toast. Yeah. I tell you, you've got to be careful what your best bit is. Like, I went through a big phase of talking about butts. I had a bit about how it was really, like how butts predicted recessions and stuff like that. Like, it was supposed to be about the skirt theory of how people, it was an inversion of that. But songs about big butts could also predict recessions. Was the bit. Perfectly serviceable. It's not in the routine anymore. But anyway, it would often go very well. Yeah. And people would be like, they'd sort of see you at the end of the gig or at another gig, and they'd be like, "Oh, it's big butt guy. Oh, it's butt man." And so whatever you do, you want to be careful, because people remember you by your bits, to coin a phrase that I didn't quite intend. But you really, it's nice to be known as philosophy guy rather than butt man. But I suppose those two things evolved together. Like, used to, studied philosophy, a big philosophy head, I suppose. Yeah. Really enjoy that sort of stuff. I think the two really overlap. I think, loads of us want to believe really romantically that there's something kind of philosophical in what we do, right? When you look at the world in a different way, a philosopher looks at the world and sees absurdity, and wants to explain it. A comedian looks at a world full of absurdity and wants to just leave it and share it. Right. Leave the absurdity sort of intact. But there's like a double mode of attack, I think, sometimes when you're looking at a concept. Like, very occasionally I don't know if you've ever done that morning pages thing where you wake up in the morning really early and you just sort of free write for a while. Lots of comedians do it as a way of generating material. Yeah. I will find that if I'm not careful, I don't need more structured prompts, but I end up writing like awful, atrocious, like, philosophy that ceases to have any gag in it, because it's sort of a surprising way of looking at the world. I'm very grumpy when I wake up in the morning, so I write these very moody sort of essays about, I don't know, how you can't trust anything or something like that. And then I have a coffee and I'm like, oh, I hate all that. But I think there's something very natural about asking, what's the deal with that? Yeah. I think a lot of your early philosophers are, Seinfeld, but without the without the annoying uptick in the end of sentences. Yeah. So it's sort of, why did philosophy emerge into it? You are, the thing that you should talk about on stage is what you know. We do about, and look, no one knows. And if anybody tells you they're good at philosophy, they're a liar. It's too hard. right? It's not possible to be good at it, in the sense that like the questions have been the same for 2,000 years. Like it's not one cannot be good at it really. It's sort of almost anti what it is. I think, you know, if you're a philosopher and you say, oh, but I've got all the answers, you're like, you've not listened to the questions. But
philosophy is easy, isn't it? It's just asking questions and not coming up with the answers. That's philosophy.
Well, yeah, I mean so
that's it right there. Bang, straight away.
Bang, nailed it.
We're all philosophers, aren't we? There's another one.
Nailed it.
It's easy.
I think it's in the heart. I sort of care about this like a lot, in the sense that the risk with associating something as universal as comedy with something that is often considered very elitist, philosophy. I'm very wary of that. Like, I really believe that everybody does it all the time. Like when you ask why about all sorts of fundamentals, about why you're doing your job, or why you love your partner, or like why the government is the way that it is, like I think there is something really universal about that, which kind of upsets me sometimes when we think of philosophy as being, I don't know, either associated with universities in a way that it doesn't have to be in any way, shape or form, or like occasionally you get it at a gig.
Right.
Occasionally, like somebody will, sort of indirectly, you'll be having a pint afterwards. It's very rarely a comic, but often it's like an audience member. They'll say things like, oh, why do you talk about all that stuff? As though it's like not a topic for conversation. Big butts. And like I really take great pride in nobody. If you've come to see an Alex Farrow show, or you see an Alex Farrow set, like you didn't need to do any reading beforehand. That sounds like a drag. Like I would hate for it to be like, I don't know, almost like an in-group thing. Like we all know concept X, or we've all read this writer, right, and therefore we can get this stuff. I think what makes it hard, what we do as a comedian, is you have to immediately construct shared experience. I think the audience is sort of responding in this parasocial relationship where it's almost like you've got to create a friend, like this multitude becomes a singularity, right? Yeah. You need all these kind of ways to make them feel in that friendship bond with you. So it wouldn't even work really if you were telling them things that were too far alien to them. Yeah. You can explain new things. I think we shouldn't talk down to an audience either. I think like you'd have spoken to Chelsea Birkby, I know, who has loads of philosophy in her set as well. We'll be doing that stuff Friday, Saturday nights in the club. Like that's where it should be. It's not just for Edinburgh Fringe. It's not just for college towns. It's really is for everyone. I care like a huge amount about that. Yeah. In a way that I have no particular like punchline for. Maybe it's because it's the school teacher thing. Maybe it's like the number of times you'll have a super smart kid, right? But for whatever reason, they feel like traditionally named academic topics, whether it's like philosophy or science or maths, is just in some way like not for them. Yeah. Like I don't really always know where it comes from. I think sometimes we tell youngsters that there's something like pretentious or like not right about traditional academia. I don't really fully know where it comes from, but it kind of emerges in sort of every generation. Almost that it's almost maybe like classist or something like that this stuff is only for some people. And I don't know. I need to analyze that more off a podcast really. But like I dislike the idea that traditionally academic topics are not for everyone. They are, absolutely.
If you're putting together a set or a show, do you begin with what you want to impart? Like maybe it be knowledge, or maybe it be just to get people to ask a question, or do you start with the jokes and try and weave them into a narrative?
I do both. Right. It's a slightly boring answer. I think of it like, I don't know. Well, I suppose the way that it's sometimes very like topic driven is occasionally I will do like thematic sets. Here in Oxford. The Natural History Museum books me in to write something about their exhibition. Yeah. So, I have lots of stuff on bacteria, for example. Yeah. I tell you what, it's very hard to do observational material about something microscopic, but it's nice to be like challenged to do that. And so you'll be you'll start with a concept. You walk around the exhibition. You'll like buy a book, by which I mean listen to a podcast about the topic that you want to do. Like, who reads anymore? Nobody reads anything anymore. You have it sort of spoken to you in your ear. Like, what sort of person? If you were a Roman emperor, you would have had everything read to you by some poor sort of servant of yours, and now we have this electronic servant to read to us. I think it's superior, but so sometimes you get, like, I'm doing something for the Internet Institute of LSE. They've asked me to write something about AI again. I keep getting lots of AI sort of commissions, which is nice. Right. But and so that comes from, I don't know, kind of an emerging, almost kind of like outreach type educational system of like public speaking, I suppose. People like the idea of introducing a conference with a stand-up comic and mixing comedy and education together. And so sometimes you'll write something bespoke for that. I run a compilation show in London these days, only recently taken it over from Charlie Duncan Safri, called Stand Up Philosophy, where that'll be thematically done. So you get 3 or 4 comics, and like comedians are speaking about kind of love, justice, identity all the time. So you'll take that as a concept, and then I will sort of interview them about the sort of the philosophy behind the jokes, right? Because there's so many things that are sort of a comedian will only be semi-consciously like doing in their sets, and so I will write a bit about the kind of the topic that they're working on. But most of the time something funny happens and you're like, oh great, I will stick that in and reverse engineer the hell out of that to make it kind of fit. Starting from the bottom up, as it were, if we were referring back to sets about big butts.
Callback, see, clever.
I tell you, a callback is one of those things that is so basic for a comedian, but so mind-blowing for an audience member. Audiences love to feel smart, and a callback is just like, you give the people what they want. Callbacks are bread and circuses for the masses. They're really easy to do. You just say the same thing later on, but it makes it look like you're, I don't know, sort of some sort of divine genius. And it's, the thing that he said at the beginning was all headed back to this point. It's like, no, it's not. You just found a way to say the word bum again twice or something. I don't know. But
I like the idea of doing philosophical talks or structuring talks around the idea of AI, which is, of course, a way of getting machines to do your thinking for you. That's an interesting direction. Where do you start with that, or do you start in that way?
In terms of writing about AI, as in where do I find it funny, or what do I like believe about artificial intelligence?
Well, how do you start addressing making observations about a thing that is observing you?
Oh, very nice. Yeah. Oh, who looks at who?
Thank you, and I'm done.
Over and out from Mark. Often with something like AI, I try and I start more with the opinion first, and so if the opinion is about, I mean, like, so many white collar jobs are like currently just being absolutely destroyed by AI. It will be it's true. It's so important, like what's going on and sort of how to deal with that and all that sort of stuff. And so you immediately you think, right, well, what's the funny angle on that? Like, the first funny angle is like, good.
Well, yeah.
Like, do you know what nobody wants? Estate agents. They can go, off they go. It's AI that, all that sort of stuff you can do quite quickly. And you can take what would be very kind of like universal butts of jokes about how nobody likes estate agents, and then you can start to sort of weave back, like, well, how do you re-engineer work? How do you think about work in a way that is both funny and kind of interesting? My favorite bit to do at the moment is a little set that's supposed to be about disobedience. You get a whole crowd to cheer if they believe in the power of disobedience, and then most of them cheer, and you go, oh, well, if you didn't cheer, like, well done. That's most disobedient thing you could have done. And then you sort of gently give them the sort of a fact about how difficult it is to engineer true creativity out of an AI, because an AI can never really disobey. It's almost by definition something you can't program into a machine. We don't really know how human beings have disobedience or whatever, or where they get that freedom to disobey from. It's sort of a mystery to us, but we believe that it's real. And then my favorite bit is then to go, but if disobedience is intelligence, the wisest, most intelligent computer algorithm for me is Microsoft Office Word, specifically its formatting function. And then I have a big rant about how that'll never do what you want it to do. And I sort of, sort of conclude that Clippy is, of course, our new AI overlord. Where's he gone? Well, Bill Gates has hidden him in his secret island or whatever. Anyway, without doing the rant, maybe it takes a lot of stuff away, but that's just an observational bit about poor technological interactions, right? It feels very sort of Rod Gilbert in a way, having a rant and rave about that. And so you can have the opinions and then you illustrate them with the observational material, or sometimes you start with facts. So I have a bit about B.F. Skinner, who's used by sort of Californians as a way of explaining how machines not only behave as though they think, but do think. And so you then you almost sort of satirize the views. And so you can start kind of that way as well. I quite like that bit, but it's weird doing bits on a podcast, isn't it? I'm not going to do my whole B.F. Skinner bit, but if people would like to see my B.F. Skinner bit, they can follow Alex Farrow Comedy on YouTube. Do like and subscribe. Anyway, why would that be interesting? Why would this be interesting to other comics? And then you can sort of do it both ways. A bit like an AI, right? So most AI is bottom up, right? It doesn't really know what the meaning would be until the meaning is transposed on it at the end. It has all these examples, let's say, of like funny things that sort of work, right. And then sort of after sort of attritioning that, it can find a purpose for them or whatever. So you can find the purpose for your bits almost like a black box AI eventually by saying and using them enough. It's like, oh, this bit's about that, right? Which is always very fun.
What about when you're performing to, like you said, if you're performing at the museum and you're doing a set on bacteria or what have you? I mean, that's niche.
Well, you'd say it's niche.
I mean, that's a very specific audience.
Oh, I suppose the audience is niche. How you signal a show does change the audience that you get. I think that doing well at comedy starts before the gig. I would almost say, almost like a war, that most of the battle is won before you're arranged on the field. And so, this is particularly true at Edinburgh Fringe. So if you have signaled to your audience correctly what they're getting, and they've read about it and heard about it and want that, it's almost easy. I mean, no, it's never easy to do or whatever, but if you have got an audience that want what you are giving, then it's so much better. One of a great example of this this year, just going to name drop my friends who I think are great. Bert Williamson, it's a really funny comic. He did some really nice signaling about who he is as a performer through his title. So his show title this year, I think, was 200 IQ plus audience only, brackets, no munters. Now, whatever you think about the type of comedy you're into or whatever, you get an idea of what that performer is from that. And in the copy, he just basically, I think, had such a good time this year because his audience would be up for a hyper arrogant persona, and with sort of kind of irreverent terminology with a touch of edge into it. What you're getting, slightly sort of edgy, playful, irreverent comedian there. Whereas I think in previous years, the title hadn't really conveyed that quite as well. And I'm sure you've heard this before, but we don't signal what sort of comedy we're doing well enough as comedians, at all. The number of times, you'll get a flyer in Edinburgh and it's John Smith's funny hour, and you're like, oh great, what kind of comedy is this, John Smith? And he'd be like, oh, it's the funny stuff. You'd never get that with like a music night, for example. Like, so I'll come to my music night, and you'd be like, oh, what's the music? And the person's like, oh, it's the stuff that you really like listening to. It's the kind of music that's good. You'd be like, oh, but is it metal or is it jazz? And people are like, they'll be like, oh, it's everything. And it'd be like, but is it though? And so when you were signaling, hello, do you want to come on a Friday night to a museum to listen to observational routines about bacteria? That is an incredibly fun gig to do because those people have self-selected for that. And it's also such a magic trick. to see an hour of stuff that's just on bacteria. You get like, I did a whole show about bats once, and like it just gets insanely silly. Like by the 20th minute that you're talking about bats, it's like he's still talking about bats.
Yeah.
Like, it's just funny. The same with bacteria. It's just impressive. If you are, as a comic, if you can chain your material, if you can theme material, you build a world. You build a world that your audience are transported to.
Yeah.
I think I've got great respect for like true one-liner comics where each joke is a new world each time. Joke 1, stop. Joke 2, stop. Joke 3, stop. Yeah. Whereas like comedians like Jamie D'Souza will weave those one-liners into a narrative such that you're lost in the narrative, or like anything that you can do to transport that audience away from thinking, oh, do I need another drink, or I'm a bit hungry actually, or the chair's not very comfortable. Like you need to take them out of all that stuff and into your universe, and you need to hold them in that universe. So the more you can theme material, like the better in many ways. Yeah. There's always massive exceptions to that, like as I say, all the fantastic one-liner comics who can start a new world each time.
Yeah. Do you have like a set sort of theory going in? So if someone says, hey, come down to our event and we want you to talk about X, is it kind of a meat grinder in terms of the joke factory just changes that word?
Yeah, making the sausage. Sometimes when you're making the sausage, you're reusing offcuts that probably shouldn't be reused. So it depends how long I have to prepare for the for the show. If I'm being really brutal, I can't know how much that's paying as well. So like, if some of these things can be very well paid. Lots of it you're doing much more for the love of it. And so that sort of how much you pay kind of signals the quality of the meat. That's gross, isn't it? But yeah, sometimes you're reusing and recycling a lot of stuff, and so there's different meanings that can be interpreted onto already existing gags. Like doing 3 years of a philosophy degree and then some postgraduate stuff. Basically, I've learned to rehash opinions about stuff very, very well. Yeah. I think that's almost what all my life has been working towards. Like writing, for want of a better word, an essay that answers a question. And if the question is, what do you think about AI, or what do you think about evolution, or God, what else have I done? Oh, what do you think about cartoon museums, art exhibition, about Dadaist themes? You're like, oh my God, right. Like, okay, I can do that. There's so much of the school system is broken in that way that we test this very like word heavy sort of essay based form of thinking that, which, does have utility outside of school, is rarely so specifically tailored to what I do. But there should be far more things that we test students on or educate them in doing, particularly in like the sciences. Science lessons are still, and I remember I was amazed by it when I was helping out, and you cover all sorts of stuff as a teacher, and I'm like, this whole GCSE curriculum is a series of facts that you must learn. Like, where's the logic? Where's the analysis? Where is the self-discovery from things from first principles? Like the whole chemistry curriculum felt like, well, here are the answers, memorize them, which it felt very, very limiting. I don't think that's the great power of the scientific method anyway. But.
As well as stand-up philosophy, you do stand-up science. Do you take science into philosophy and philosophy into science? Is there a Venn diagram that draws the two together?
If there is money to be made and a good time to be had from combining the word stand-up with another thing, Alex Farrow is the writer-performer for it. So like stand-up science, I think, is less close. I think the concept isn't quite as exciting as stand-up philosophy, because I think there's something really interesting about, as I say, what stand-ups do, which is semi kind of philosophical because you're deconstructing concepts.
Yes.
So the process, what is philosophy? It's taking often things that we already like know or that we think we know and deconstructing them. Whereas something like stand-up science is much more a case of like, here are some wonderful things about the world. Like, here's a fact, and now let's think about what's funny about it in a way that if stand-up uses the philosophical method, I'm not entirely sure stand-up uses the scientific method. So the scientific method is almost kind of reverse in structure. So if it's supposed to be, I don't think it ever really is this, but it's supposed to be, the scientist goes out into the world and sees 100 ducks and goes, well, what do we learn about duck behavior from these 100 things, right? That's sort of supposed to be the standard, the scientific method. Whereas a philosopher is like, what is a duck? It starts with like, we already know what a duck is, but like, is a duck always something that flies? Is a duck something that must have a beak? If a duck is something that must have a beak, is a duck-billed platypus a duck? Well, probably not. It'll, that's a satire of the philosophical method. But I think one is much closer to the process of stand-up than the other. Although stand-up science, I think, has got a much wider appeal. I think that partly because it's done so poorly in the national curriculum. Right. This is not to criticize any individual teacher, by the way. I think teachers of science are some of the most inspiring people like around. But like, it's like science should be thrilling. It should be exciting to like read and consume it. And sort of everybody kind of knows that it's not. It's why there's such demand for pop science books. It's why the popular science section of a library is much, much bigger. It's why it's so difficult. It's why you have get into STEM type things, because there's a shortage, particularly of particular groups going into like STEM, science, technology, engineering and stuff. And why? Because we present it in a really dry way. Yeah. And it's like, so to get around that, I think people are like, we know that, if you're not interested in science or philosophy, it's like, well, that is reality. Like, how can we make reality boring? And so somehow, if we are presenting scientific stuff, sometimes it's like, well, we've made the universe uninteresting, and that is a disaster. Yeah, as a philosophical disaster, that is, why live? why live if there is nothing interesting in the universe? And so I think there's a real demand for an excitement for comics, or charismatic individuals talking about things that are interesting and that matter. Yeah. And by making something interesting, you're halfway to making it funny anyway. And so, a big believer in this as a project, I think.
So speaking of reality becoming uninteresting.
On the subject of reality. Can we bring this back down to earth?
In terms of reality being uninteresting, how was your lockdown experience in comedy terms? Did you do Zoom gigs? Did you take time out? Did you write copiously?
Well, so there was the period where very little happened. There was that period where, do you remember, maybe this was just me, but I'm pretty sure for a long time, everybody thought this was going to be 2 weeks. There was like a revolving time. It was like, it'll be another 2 weeks. It'll be another 2 weeks. It'll be another 2 weeks. And then you were like, this feels like more than this. During the initial lockdown itself, I was a full-time live performer at that stage, and so all my work went. And I never really understood, actually. You sort of something, you read history textbooks, and you'll hear about like the Great Depression or times of economic unrest, and somebody will lose their work and they'll be in despair. I never really sort of understood that. I always knew, in your head, that will be a bad thing. But when people, in the deindustrialization of the north of England, for example, when people were like, but I am a miner. This is what they do. And somebody, when they closes the mine, they go into great despair. I understood that. I really turned on myself. I was like, what an idiot. Oh, you idiot, Alex. Of course you can't do this. You can't. you could never be a comedian for a living. Like obviously this could never be something that like continued. And it was a really interesting moment where I was like, I understand what I read about in sort of history lessons and something about the toxicity of how we define ourselves via our work rather than through our families or our creative projects. And so that was like a big lesson very quickly. And then very quickly I threw myself into all the ways kind of around it. And so the comedy club I run, Jericho Comedy, actually, if in a really bleak twist, turned out to be in its most successful year from that summer of 2020 to 2021. Jericho Comedy was very busy with drive-in shows. It was one of the only comedy clubs running for at least a month. I remember my first show was with the good people of Suzuki. It would have been, I think, probably one of the first live events after that initial proper, like, I suppose all the lockdowns were proper, but the big first one. It was in Birmingham Airport. And we still weren't supposed to be face to face with anybody. And so it was all contactless. I came into Birmingham City Airport. There was a big stage with an enormous screen, and there were all these cars. Would have been nearly 1,000, I think, a huge venue, inverted commas. And I was directed via phone to where I would be performing on this stage. And then I heard my voice echoing out into this car park to silence, complete silence. Not having seen a human being at this place, doing 20 minutes of just stuff about the postman to a car park full of people is identical just to screaming into a car park full of just cars. There was a moment in the middle of it where I just wanted to be like, get out of your cars. I need to know you're here. I need to know that I've not gone like insane. It was really weird, really, really, really weird. And then later on, people were like, you know, learning that stand-up requires that sense of conversation, right? Stand-up is a monologue disguised as a dialogue, right? And so you need that second half of what you do, otherwise it ceases to exist, right? And so whether it was a Zoom show or a drive-in show, you need to simulate dialogue even when it's not there. And so increasingly, like, bizarre, people would be like, do you want it filthier? And people would be putting their windscreen wipers on, or like, if you're loving it, stick the hazards on. And and then obviously people start honking and stuff. It was like doing stand-up in a traffic jam. But there's a reason the drive-in shows didn't like catch on. There was a lot of talk, I think, certainly after the first few months, being like, and outdoor shows, there'll be something that really, why don't we do those? And there's a reason why stand-up works a little bit better indoors, for sure. And so creativity is often turboed or caused by like restrictions. And so if you're sometimes, like, if you are thinking of how to write a bit, it's often if you're writing a comedy character in a sitcom, for example, it's like the restriction of that character is what produces the jokes. It's like they could have any belief or thought, but if they are a petty individual, well, that's the restriction. And so actually it's kind of rules that ironically are required for the freedom of creativity. And so having those restrictions sort of forced a lot of people to be very creative, did really very inspiring, very cool things, a lot of cool podcasts sort of came out. And I was very disappointed when people got a bit snobby about it. I think people were like, oh, not another podcast. And I remember being like, why not? Great. Maybe it's got an audience of 2 people. Well, brilliant. Like, brilliant for that person finding an audience of 2 people. If those 2 people love what that is. Great. More. And so, and niche as well. I mean, that's the great gift of the digital age, isn't it? That actually to find your audience to be niche is actually better. Like, all you need is a couple of 100 people globally to be into your thing. And then that's almost like, I don't know, if they all give you a tenner a month. I mean, that's a great living. You know what I mean? And so there's still so much room for becoming more niche, more specific. There's growth room. You know, sometimes I don't know. Maybe you don't pick this up, but there's a real insecurity amongst comedians about where our place will be in the future for it, and because it's so many people start it every year and stuff like that. I think there is enormous growth room for people to be like humorous, and we have to be like creative in what we do, what we talk about, how we talk about it, how we present it, and how we reach audiences. I really think we're in a golden age for reaching audiences through this creative medium. I hope it continues, but like I'm certain that with hindsight we'll look at this time as being a very positive one for creativity, like access as well. It's very unfashionable to say that access is good in the stand-up comedy world, because we can do so much more for it. But like the old gatekeepers are worried about where their place in things are when you have great access to an audience via this device, the mobile phone, that is currently not being gatekept. The great disruptors, you know, these social media tech companies, you know, it almost feels like a gold rush sometimes. It's like there were audiences to be had and captured, should we want to. And almost everybody's got a mobile phone. It's open to everyone. Those people who sell out at the Fringe, it's almost kind of reversed the Fringe. Some people in the past would go to the Fringe to find the audience. Now you've got this kind of reverse system where you found your audience through this exceptionally democratic meme generating access device, and then you can capture that in Edinburgh, ideally through something like the Free Fringe, which is an incredible thing that not every like festival around the world has. Like, it's not Melbourne, it's not Montreal. I think we can do so much more for access at these things, but we shouldn't be shy about talking about how excellent a handful of things are right now, because we don't empower people by saying how impossible it is.
It's interesting that what you're talking about, new comedians, so many new comedians starting up. And there's a conversation I was having about the statistics, at least it was true a few years ago. I don't know if it's been affected by the pandemic, but I think about 60% of comedians drop out within 3 years.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But also now you've got newer comics are coming out, but that's because people who weren't able to or weren't in a position to perform comedy now can. Because obviously they've been restricted by race or gender or, you know, they now have new voices, but then that means they have different source material. They're talking about things that other comics aren't talking about. So, you know, maybe there are new comics coming in, but they are comics that are saying things different to what comics have gone before.
And I mean, what the fun game of stand-up comedy is like, or comedy in general, actually, is how quickly like tastes change. I mean, it's true. It's like to watch some stuff from a few decades ago, it can be really like, wow. Even stuff that you consumed as a younger person, right? You'll be like, oh my god. Well, what?
Trust me, I grew up in the 70s.
But and it's not just about sort of like the morality of stuff and how tastes on that sort of kind of move and change, but like the simplicity versus the complexity. Like it just changes. And so new people coming in tend to be like better at that sort of stuff. I mean, I can't help but feel like, so I've listened to a few of these podcast episodes, and one thing that happens on this one, as well as on so many comedy podcasts, is that the word comedy and stand-up are used interchangeably in a way that like is to do with how dominant stand-up is at the moment. And I reckon there's no reason why stand-up will continue to have the dominance that it does. Both on things like Netflix or the live scene, particularly because the majority of comedy probably consumed at the moment is probably on a form of social media, almost certainly in terms of views on something like TikTok. And the majority of that is sketch, solo sketch most of the time. But like live sketch performance has been out of fashion since, I don't know, like you think of kind of Monty Python in the sort of the 70s, maybe 80s, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But people are consuming this video format sketch stuff, and then they often then go to see a live performer do a slightly different medium, or very different medium in some cases, stand-up. And you know, often that works and it's really good. A lot of the time, you know, I won't mention any names, but there's a handful of people I know who've got these big followings from social media, and they'll pop their head around the curtain and we'll just be like, oh no. And I remember saying to this particular individual, and they went, oh no. I was like, what's going on? And she was just like, they're here. I'm like, well, who? Who's here? And she just went, my fans. And one of the things that she finds so difficult, this particular TikTok star, is that her TikTok is sketch and very different to her stand-up. Yeah. And they've come for her, and she's being her through this different medium.
Yes. But
they're like, well, why aren't you dancing? Why aren't you doing that? Yeah. Yeah. I won't say too much before, I don't know, this person sort of identified, but what was I saying about this? Oh, the changing of things, right? Like, will the next generation of funny performers be much more sketch based? Yeah. Like, I know Adam Flood, for example, is really good at doing something very similar on his live performance to what's been done in his TikToks, where he'll use a lot of voice modulation and like will move seamlessly between stand-up and slightly more sketchy bits. And I'm like, oh, that's how it starts. Yeah. And so like maybe in like 5 years time, I don't know, you know, we'll be thinking like, oh, do you remember when everybody was doing stand-up? And it got a bit like I don't know, cliche, perhaps.
Well, like some of the new comics that I've seen coming out in the last year, in terms of Edinburgh debuts, is people like Kathy Manura, Lorna Rose Treen, who are doing characters.
Yeah. It started, Mark. It started. The change has started. I need to get the toasters back out and do a character.
Yeah, exactly. But also, again, it's interesting you talk about the difference between what you see on the social media and what you, or indeed on television, and what you see live. And the example that sprung to mind then was John Kearns, who obviously got a whole new group of people who became interested in John Kearns because of his appearance on Taskmaster. But if you've ever seen him perform live, those are two very different things. And of course, the social media, again, the advent of new technology means that you can do things that you can't do on stage. So talking about Edinburgh shows, as we alluded to a little bit earlier on, how is your festival experience and how has it changed?
I love Edinburgh Festival. I'm an enormous advocate of the free fringe. I think it's an incredible way for people to access that festival without so much of the risk that comes with other spaces. I've been doing that for a long time now, I suppose. One of the benefits of being a teacher is you get your August off, and so you can come. You know, you do it in teacher prep in the day, and then going wild by night. All that kind of stuff. I've built up a nice little audience in the Fringe, which is really lovely. They come back to see where's Alex at in his life. It's really like something's very moving, particularly with the free Fringe, when you can have that pay what you want model to reserve a seat. And you give all the options from I think I do a £5 to £12.50 or something like that. And the number of people who will go for that £12.50 when they really don't have to is really, when you stop and think sometimes, it's like, oh, that is somebody who wants you to keep doing what you're doing. And that is really, 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 really nice. I don't use the word moving lightly, but because you often then you don't really get to thank them properly. You do it at the end of the show, but you're like, oh, but that's such a nice thing. And I sell out a medium-sized room on the free Fringe these days. It's really really lovely. What else do I think about the Fringe? I think that in the United Kingdom we are very poor at recognizing what is really good about things that we do. Having been to other festivals globally, the Edinburgh Fringe is incredible. If nothing else, via its size and its scope. The second biggest one, Melbourne, that starts at 6 p.m. You could have seen 8 shows if you were really going for it by that time. and across not just comedy, but music, dance, literature, like that time in August, I just discover a new festival. You know, there's like a TV festival that every year I go up there, there's like this other festival also going on. Like, there's another one, you know, you've got I was like, it's so, there's so much of it. And there's so many people doing such creative and original work there. It is the best of something in the world. It really, really is. It is. And it breaks my heart that it's so hard sometimes to say stuff about the United Kingdom in the 21st century. It is truly like incredible, and it needs to be looked after. It needs to be protected. Did you know we can, like, the Fringe Society, who, you know, controls so much of the festival, you know, we can all vote for who they are.
Yeah.
I didn't know this recently. I was like, I can do what? You know, we talk about it as though they're like, you know, dark wizards somewhere, and you can stand to be that, and you can like help be a part of the people who award the sort of the prizes and stuff like that. And it's like, maybe this is to do with having just entered into my 30s 6 years ago, but I'm now like, I'm so much more like thinking, well, you know, I should be being more civic. I suppose you can be like a member. It's annoying it costs a fiver, but like, and all the comics listen to this, next time spend that fiver in like July or June to become a member of the Fringe Society, and then seek out who's standing, or stand yourself to be in that performer role on the committee, or like vice versa. Like, I'm always like, we as comedians love to moan. Oh, we love to moan. And do you know what we really love to moan about? We love to moan about the Fringe. Oh, love to moan about the Fringe. But then almost all of us don't engage in that, in the process of making it better.
Yes.
Or being honest about what is good about it, as well as what's bad about it. And so the Free Fringe is an incredible thing. And it's a way that people can not just not lose money, but can be fairly paid for their labor. And I think it should be protected, extended. I think the real Fringe, in many ways, or the spirit of the Fringe, is best encapsulated by that. That's not to say that like larger venues don't have a wonderful role to play, particularly with some more complex forms of performance that need so much more than like simple stand-up. But join the Fringe Society and vote, or indeed stand for making it a better thing. It is the best of its type in the world. And that's incredible, and long may it continue.
So we've talked a lot about philosophy. What are the philosophies of your own that you've developed forward with you?
It do be like that sometimes. That is a good question. I think that stand-up comics are given a nice answer to the type of existential worries and dread that can happen about meaning and purpose. I think one of the reasons why stand-up comedy is so addictive and so like consuming is that it gives a reason for the things that happen to you. I think lots of creative processes can do that, and I don't think it's just creative processes that are needed for this. But when something happens in your life, particularly if it's a bad thing, you already have this process, this thing where you can be like, right, I can capture this, and I can make a good thing out of it. I can make people laugh about it. When you are reading something, when you were talking to someone, it's almost impossible to be bored by reality, because you are undergoing hardcore training about how to make reality fascinating, interesting, exciting, useful. And so this kind of like the posh philosophical word for it is like ennui, this kind of boredom that can sneak into life if you're repeating the same kind of things kind of every day with certain types of work, or with relationships that you have, or something like that. Like, you are given this like special gift where like every experience that you have, you're sort of trained to make it incredible, or to make it seem like it has a thing that you can do with it, right? So you can have that as a writer. If you're incredibly impressive, you can take your everyday experiences and turn them into dance. It's really nice that stand-up comics can have access to that in a way that I hope for any non-stand-up comics listening, you can find your own sort of way of that. Like, there's an incredible book by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. Forgive me for the awful pronunciation, but the book is called Flow, and it's the science of satisfying life, essentially. And this idea of flow, this sense that, like, when you're having an experience, you are just fully immersed into it. You are really experiencing it for in a satisfying way. Like, comedians are very good at finding flow, like either whether that's on stage or whether that's in day-to-day life. Like, flow is still the opposite of boredom. You know, people sometimes talk about it as being like in the zone. Like, athletes can get it sometimes, where like they say things like, I don't think, I just do. This sense that you kind of lose yourself within an activity. And Mihai Csikszentmihalyi talks about, well, what are the exact types of thing that an activity requires in order to get this sense of flow? Musicians often get it when they're either improvising a new piece or they're playing a new piece in a way that just transforms them into this other place. This sense of you don't think, you just do. There's a sort of a spirituality to that don't think, just do. And there is a real moment, like on stage, where when you've got that audience sort of with you, it feels like you're surfing a wave or playing an instrument, where each word that you pick next, you're not consciously picking it. It's like it's coming to you. You're in flow. You can't think about the stone in your shoe or what you had for breakfast or what you're doing the next day. It's just so completely immersive, and what you're doing next is just working. And that sense of flow, that sense of ecstatic just being, rather than worrying or thinking or having dread or anxiety, is like an incredible experience. And if you can find your way of that within stand-up, or if you can find your thing, there is a artificial distinction between work and play. So some things are dreadful and we call them work, and we need to be compensated for them, right? But sometimes the things that people do for play seem identical to work, right? So for play, some people will spend lots of time fixing engines. They'll get into their flow state via that. Yet also sometimes that can be work, can be awful work, dirty work that you find like really hard and difficult to do. But if you can construct your mind and your experience to get into flow states with it, and some things are much better for getting to flow than others, I think that is about as close as I've ever got to what the meaning of it all is, I think. And that is, forgive me for being an absolute monstrous pretentious wanker, but you did ask me what my philosophy was. So it's something to do with that, I think. If you can get into flow, that is ecstasy. It's another word for it sometimes.
What so far then, in your experience, have been the best and worst moments in comedy?
Oh, very nice. Well, your best moments are always those flow moments.
Yes.
I mean, that follows on quite easily. Yeah, that being absolutely, for me, it's always in the more improvisational bits, like true flow. I do a lot of hosting. I do a lot of kind of MCing. And like sometimes it's just each thing. You don't think, you just do. And you are like overwhelmed by like the laughter response, and it just keeps coming and it keeps going, and it's really, really, really nice. It's not always nice in the sense that you always get the difficult shows. For whatever reason, you've not taken that audience into your world. They've not gone with you. I don't know, like I was just telling this to a friend on the phone last night, actually. I was like, forgive me, a slightly blue like reference. When it's not working, it sometimes feels like you've had too much to drink, but you're still trying to have sex. And like you're staring at the audience in their eyes, and they want it to be working sometimes, and it's just not working. But you know, you you've started and you have to keep going. And you'll be saying things like, oh no, it happens to a lot of comedians. And it's just like, oh, like you're trying to like, they're feeling not right. And you're like, oh, it's really like a horrible, horrible feeling. I mean, the best person to explain this, I was a bit rude about Seinfeld earlier, but he says that people have two greatest fears. The second greatest fear that people always list is death. And you're like, oh, that's a bit heavy, Seinfeld. All right. And you go, what's their first greatest fear? And they always go, public speaking. So like the feeling of it going badly when you're speaking to a group of people for millions of people is worse than death, right? And then he very wryly says, if you're at a funeral, so many people would prefer to be in the casket than they would doing the eulogy. It's a very nice way to sort of summarize it. Yeah. But like that feeling of it just being like, just not working. You feel insane because you look insane. Yeah. Because it needs to have the laughter to it. Yeah. Like if there's no laughter there, it's not just that it's not working. It doesn't exist. Yeah. The performance requires the second half of the conversation. Yeah. You've come to see a dialogue, but what you just see is a person speaking into a void. And it looks identical to having not written any comedy.
Yeah. It's like you're talking to a car park full of empty cars.
It's like talking to a car park full of empty cars. That's probably the analogy I probably should use. Call back. Nice. Nice. Yeah, very nice. Yeah. Those will be the deaths on stage, I suppose. Yeah. Those are some of the more negative ones. Yeah, what do people normally say for that? The worst experiences?
Stag do's.
Yeah. Do you know what? I think that actually, if you want my opinion on the matter, stag do is one level up from worst. So I think the difference between bombing and dying is the difference between dealing with a stag do and dealing with silence. So to die is to have nothing. Like if you have a rowdy or a heckly crowd, horrible. Right, the classic stag or hen, right, and they're interrupting, and you're having to sort of roast them back, or like that can sometimes not go well. But at least it happened. You were treated like a person doing the thing. Yeah, like you were. It's the difference between being punched or slapped. Right. Right. Like you're slapped as a child. You're not seen as a full adult. Like when you're punched. This is the turn the other cheek metaphor, isn't it? Like the supposed real origin of that is that when you turn the other cheek, it's so that the person comes back to you and punches you as an equal rather than slapping you like a child. And when you are, we have those dickheads in the crowd who are the stag do's, at least they're registering you as a human being, admittedly not one that's supposed to be doing what they're supposed to be doing. But the silence of the folded arms and that look of like almost like pained, like I wanted this to be right. Yeah. I mean, obviously I've got no idea because I've never died on stage, but I'm just, listening to the things that other comedians have said. But like the difference between bombing and dying is huge, I think. To bomb is, people like smiled through it, or maybe they heckled. Like booing. Yeah. Booing is kinder than silence. Always. Yeah, I think anyway, but that's not to say that stag and hens are an ideal format for comedy.
Alex, how can we find out about you? How can we find out where you're playing next?
I am on the internet. I am at https://www.alexfarrow.com. And then you can see my calendar for if you ever wanted to burgle me, presumably. But if you're trying to burgle me, I only put the good stuff on the calendar. But almost all of my live performance, you can find that. I'm a user of YouTube. If you'd like to see, particularly the crowd work stuff. I think the crowd work stuff I'm very proud of. I don't put a lot of it up there, but when I think it's interesting, particularly when I think it demonstrates something unique about what it means to be in a crowd or be a real human being, I think there's a great opportunity to find out what people really think and feel through crowd work. You don't have to just say who's having sex with whom and why their job makes them a loser or whatever. There's a real honesty you can get from this from being observed by 100 people as you respond to people. Yeah. There's the adrenaline produces a sort of kind of truth, and sometimes you can capture that in crowd work, and it's really cool. Yeah. So yeah, YouTube, Alex Farrow, and then the internet, the World Wide Web.
My last question, same question I ask all of my guests: how would you summarize comedy in a nutshell?
Comedy in a nutshell. Thomas Hobbes said that laughter was an expulsion of glory from the body. And I think that comedy is an incredible and essential part of the human experience. And that if you are not consuming that or not seeking it out in your day-to-day life, that's to me like saying you're not interested in food or love or sex or romance. It is just as important, just as special, and it is a glorious, glorious thing.
Alex, thanks so much. It's been an absolute pleasure and privilege. Thank you.
Oh, pleasure, Mark. Thanks, man.